My name is Laura. I'm an attorney at Nelson Hartman recently, which is a boutique law firm in Los Angeles that works with healthcare providers of all different types, so doctors, psychologists, other types of therapists, and also larger healthcare entities. I'm of counsel at Nelson Hartman. I'm also general counsel to a company called Science 37 that's developing a new model for network clinical providers, so that's something I'm excited about. And I have my own little small law firm that does pretty much just employment contracts, so things are busy, but I'm excited to be here. And how many of you are in your first year of residency? So, second and third year. Is there anyone who's in a fellowship? Oh. Okay. So I have a lot of respect for the dedication and the effort and the sweat that goes into getting to where you are now. I have sort of surrounded by doctors in my family. My husband's a doctor, my sister's a doctor, my dad's a doctor, my two brothers-in-law are doctors. My 5-year-old doctor, my 5-year-old daughter, is really sick about me. For some reason, she likes to call him doctors. Yeah, he's a doctor. I think she might not remember. But at any rate, I know it takes a lot of work to get here. I also know that most physicians in their training don't get a lot of information about things like employment contracts, running a business, setting up a practice. And so I'm hoping that today you can leave with a better understanding of the basic components of a contract and where you should focus your efforts if you want to negotiate, where you can kind of. So there's going to be a lot of information. It's all also in the handout, and there's a lot of other great resources. I know that CIR also has a good manual on contract negotiation. So there's a lot of information out there. To start off with, though, I want to emphasize, I think it's a good idea when you get your employment contract, not only to read it, which like you're already going to be beyond 60% of the people if you just read it, so A+ there, but to actually get some legal advice on it, because there's a lot of language and a lot of terminology that hopefully will never affect you, because the truth is, as long as the relationship goes well, you'll probably never look at that contract again. But if things go awry, you will want to look at that contract, and you want to have a solid handle on what it says. So I encourage you to consult legal, to seek legal advice on your contract. I think consulting a lawyer also, if you're really uncomfortable asserting your position, can make it easier. You can blame things on the lawyer. You can say, my lawyer told me this. I realize you guys don't do this way, but my lawyer helped me understand that this is pretty standard. You should also believe whatever you're saying, but if you need somebody to blame, we're here for you. I also think one of the most important tools you'll have when you go into reading an employment contract and negotiating if you need to is more information about what other people are being paid, what other people's schedules look like, where they're working, how much control they have. All of that information is going to help you have a better sense of whether what's in front of you is fair and normal, or if it's a little obnoxious, or if it's just not very well written. So I really encourage you to talk amongst yourselves and to seek as much information as possible about those kinds of terms as soon as you get your contract, if not before. All right, so we can click ahead. So the main things we're going to talk about today are who's the employer. You can work for different types of entities, so you can't work for just anybody. What it means to be an employee versus an independent contractor. The importance of getting your contract in writing, and then we'll cover some of the basic, kind of most important terms that you see in a contract, and we'll also talk about what to focus on when or if you decide to negotiate. And then we'll think about talk a little bit about what comes next in your next contract. If we have time, we'll talk a little bit about family leave laws and maternity laws. That's something that people have expressed an interest in the past, but I don't know if we're really going to have time. So anyway, to move on. In California, and this is not true of everywhere, so I'm a California attorney, I'm going to focus on California law. In California, we have a really strong doctrine called corporate practice of medicine. And the basic idea behind the corporate practice of medicine doctrine is that physicians and many other types of healthcare professionals should only work for other doctors or other healthcare professionals because if they work for a general business corporation, their professional judgment will be compromised by the profit motive. That's the idea. Now, we can all think of many counterexamples of where non-physician corporations have patient best interests at heart, and so physicians, ethics might be a little bit on the dodgy side, but nonetheless, that's the law of the land. So what that means for you is that you need to make sure that whenever you're seeing your employment contract, that the entity for whom you're working is a professional corporation. Not just an S corp or a C corp, that means nothing in this context, but a professional corporation. So you can find that out by looking them up on the Secretary of State's website and making sure that they are, if you're working for a medical group, that it's Dr. John Smith, MD, Inc., something like that, or trauma, or Valley Hematology, Oncology, Trauma, Medical Corporation, that kind of thing. You want to see medical or MD in the name, and that tells you that it is a properly formed professional corporation. If it's not a professional corporation, it shouldn't be practicing medicine, for one thing. You probably shouldn't work with it. It's not the hardest fix in the world, and it's not, in general, the end of the world, but it is one of those problems that's just like not worth having. So make sure that you're working for a professional corporation. This can get a little bit confusing in situations where, for example, you are providing medical services to a drug treatment program, which is general business corporation. You need to be providing those services as an independent contractor through a professional medical corporation or absolute right. That's what we want, but we can talk about that. The bottom line is that you cannot work for an LLC. That's the main thing. Nor should you form an LLC to render medical services. If you decide to form your own corporation, it needs to be a professional medical corporation. A lot of people screw this up. Again, it's not going to sting you, but if you get in trouble for anything else, it'll be bad. Next slide. Okay, so the people that we stand before are like the professional corporations, in which 51% of the shares are owned by a licensed physician. The other 49% can be owned by other types of healthcare professionals, but it can never be an unlicensed person. So, for example, if I'm not a licensed healthcare provider, I'm a licensed if me and my husband decided to form a corporation in Southland, I won't be able to do that law. And I decided to hire one of you, don't work for us. That is a bad corporation. Why? Because as a shareholder, I'm breaking the law. I cannot be a shareholder of a professional medical corporation. So get a sense of who you're working for. I'm not going to go into the naming requirements, but the bottom line is that medical corporations have certain types of names, like so the main thing is that it should have ND or medical in the name.
Is it really exclusively MD, or can it be a licensed optometrist or a licensed acupuncturist or a licensed
right, those are also the different types. The professional corporation, so professional medical corporation has a medical in the title, but you can be a professional acupuncture corporation. If you're rendering medical services, the medical needs to be in the title. It is possible for like an acupuncturist or a naturopath or a psychologist to hire an MD. That's a sort of that doesn't happen that often, but it's possible. But pretty much any kind of licensed healthcare worker in California, so RNs, NPs, PAs, psychologists, all of them have to be professional corporations. So for MDs, it should be Jane Jones MD or Jane Jones Medical Corporation. For psychologists, it would be like Ann Smith, a psychological corporation. But so you can have a different name, other name that doesn't have medical in it, but you have to have a fictitious name permit for that. So you can look those up. Sorry, I don't want to get too much into the naming requirements. Just look for doctors and maybe set or other licensed healthcare providers properly. Okay, so there are a couple of exceptions to the corporate practice of medicine bar. One is that you can work for university-operated clinics, which some of you probably do already. Hospitals can subsidize a portion of your salary through hospital improvement agreements, which some of you may encounter. There are agreements that hospitals form with medical groups whereby the hospital pays for part of the physician's salary in order to make sure that there's that type of physician represented at the hospital. Also, narcotics screening program clinics, and then physicians who supervise into the hospital can be employed by the hospital. Most of these, sorry, what about S3Cs? Yeah. my guest is she asked about federally qualified health clinics at FQHC, and I actually don't know if they can directly employ physicians or not. They might contract with the physician group, and so the FQHC has a contract with the physician group. I haven't thought of that. So most of you will probably be brought on as employees. Some of you may have the opportunity to be an independent contractor. Sometimes employees are referred to as W-2s, referred to the tax forms you fill out. Contractors are sometimes called 1099s. The main difference, though, is not what you're called, but how much control you have over the program. So if you decide your own schedule, bring your own tools, show up when you want to show up, schedule your own patients, or contract directly with staff to schedule things for you, you may qualify as an independent contractor. If the employer sets the schedule, sets the wages, tells you when you need to be there, tells you how much vacation time you have, and so on, you're an employee. Sometimes employers want to fudge this a little bit because they don't want to pay payroll taxes. But you should know that what's written in the contract is less important than what happens on the ground. So again, the employer has a substantial level of control over your work. You're an employee, even if you're called an independent contractor. And this is relevant because employees have a lot of rights that independent contractors don't. One thing to note though is the corporate practice bar applies equally to independent contractors and employees. So a general business corporation can't hire an independent contractor and practice medicine through the corporation. The independent contractor can practice medicine for patients or people who are involved in the corporation, but it can't be a corporation making no decisions whether the doctor is or it's the main, so we're going to move on to contracts, but the main thing with contracts is you want to have it in writing. Nobody has to review a handshake agreement because that's not what happens tonight. But most of you I would guess are going to have actual written employment contracts. But as recently as maybe 8 years ago, that wasn't entirely the norm. So if for some reason you're working in the super old school practice and they don't want to write it down, I strongly advise you to get something written down. If it's not in writing, it's much harder to enforce the terms of the contract. So it's not as if you can't have a contract if there is no writing. There's something called an implied contract that arises through the course of dealing. So for example, if I'm a professional medical corporation and I hire you, but we don't have anything in writing, but I just pay you every 2 weeks and you show up from 8 to 5 every day and then then we do that for like a year, we've got a contract even though we don't have something written down. And if I suddenly stop paying you, you can still sue me on the basis of our implied contract. You don't want to have to do that though. It's better to have that in writing. The other thing, the other reason why you want it in writing is not just because implied contracts are kind of difficult, but people remember things surprisingly differently, and also there are fraud and abuse laws that require the contracts to be in writing. And those are usually one of the avoiding the letters, just the fraud and abuse laws. So now that we've talked about getting it right, let's just talk about what goes into the actual contract. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, before we get into that, when I talk about some of the difference between contracts and offer letters, some of you, particularly people who work for academic medical institutions, may get an offer letter. An offer letter tends to be much more brief than a contract. It's usually like a page or a page and a half, much less specific. Often refers to documents that are not included in the offer letter, so it'll say things like, as an employee of X University, you will be bound by the terms and conditions of the employee manual or the blah blah academic manual, whatever. And so you want to see if you can get that handle that the university employee has, or at least access to it, oftentimes online, and get a sense of what's included. Because if you sign that up for letter, you're agreeing to provide by that handbook. It's probably not a really fun read, but this is a good picture of life. Take a look at it. Offer letters can be binding or non-binding. They'll usually state directly if they're binding or non-binding. Should I not use it? I don't know if I can. Okay. So, sorry. Okay, so let's move on to some of the key terms in a contract. A contract will almost always begin with a set of. Okay. I just don't want anyone to feel sort of crazy by it. You can hear me if I just talk.
That's actually better.
Okay, so let me know if you can't hear me, and I'll turn it back on. An employment contract typically starts with a series of representations that say things like, the physician is duly licensed in the state of California, doesn't have any discipline against her license, is qualified, has a DEA registration number, and so on. It's pretty basic stuff, but you want to make sure that every single one of those representations is true, because if it's not, that could invalidate the whole contract. Because they're basically saying, this contract is based on our belief that you are qualified to enter into this relationship, and our representation that we are qualified to offer you employment. So they'll cover things like that you're licensed and in good standing, you've got your DEA number, you're board certified or board eligible, and that you don't have any pending disciplinary actions, and also that you are Medicare eligible and Medicaid, or Medi-Cal eligible often as well. There's nothing to negotiate there, but you should, like I said, just read it and understand it. Oftentimes, the next part of the contract will cover the duties, your duties as a physician. And typically, in this part of the contract, it will outline the services that you're expected to render, your hours, your availability, how much you're expected to be available to work per year. So implicitly, how much vacation time you might have. Your on-call responsibilities. If you have any marketing responsibilities, typically you would see that in a contract with a smaller practice or a group where you're expected to do some marketing of its practice. You won't see that in like a Kaiser contract. If you have any administrative duties, if you're expected to be involved in helping manage the practice or run it, besides providing patient care. And then if you have other supervisory responsibilities over mid-levels, PAs and RNs and NPs and so on. So in this section, I would really encourage you to get as much clarity as possible. For example, if it says that you are required to provide administrative services to the practice, ask what that looks like. It may mean nothing. It may mean you just go to the meetings once a month or once a week, or it may be a little bit more intensive. If you have supervisory duties, you want to know how many PAs might be working with me, how many NPs, RNs, and so on. And similarly with marketing, is marketing actually something we do, or are you guys just using a form contract and it's in there but it's not really an expectation? I think these things are particularly important, just these sort of extras, the marketing, administrative, that kind of supervisory stuff, because particularly if your salary is dependent on productivity at all, those kinds of things can affect your productivity. If you have serious administrative duties, that could potentially decrease your productivity and subsequently your salary. So I encourage you to get a clear picture of what those things involve, not just by talking to the person hiring you, but if possible, by talking to other physicians in the practice. In terms of the services, the work hours, the work hours and the availability, the on-call responsibilities, oftentimes the contract will say something like, the physician is expected to be available for work during regular business hours, 5 days a week, and will be expected to share call equally with other physicians in the practice. Or it might say something like, physician is expected to work a schedule to be determined in the sole and exclusive discretion of the employer. In either of those cases, again, you want to get more clarity. Because, for example, if you're talking about a primary care clinic, regular business hours for them may include Saturdays. They may have Saturday hours. They may do evening hours. So get a clear read on what regular business hours means. Your availability, again, you want to know how many weeks per year are you going to be working. Implicitly, that'll tell you something about vacation. Make sure those things line up. And then on-call responsibilities, you want to know not just what is the call schedule and what's my expected participation, but how are those things determined? Is call split evenly among everybody? Does seniority come into play? If I need a modification, what do I do? And you don't need to have the whole employee manual inserted into the contract, but you just want to get a sense of how flexible things are if you have a say, or if you're completely at the mercy of the practice in terms of your schedule. And I would say, you know, I wonder sometimes if I'm sort of overdoing it on this, but recently a good friend of ours, she's like been in practice for 15 years, a heavy-duty academic medicine, and then went into private practice, found herself in a situation where she is on call every single weekend. And this isn't, she's not a newbie, she just didn't read the contract, and she didn't negotiate any clarity on that, and because she's the lowest person on the totem pole, even though she's been in practice for a good long time, she's got checked. You don't want to be that person. So get some clarity on what the processes are. To talk a little bit more about coverage, like I said, so sometimes there will be a separate coverage section that goes more in depth into which types of hours you're supposed to be available, how many half days per week. If you're in a specialty like urology where you're expected to be in clinic a certain number of days a week and then in the operating room a certain number of days a week, often it'll say that. Again, the bottom line here is that you want to have some clarity. At the same time, you want to get a sense of what is again, like what is flexible, how much room you have to change things around if necessary. I think that's probably particularly important for people who have kids or family responsibilities, but to get a real sense of how it actually works mechanically in the practice. Okay, moving on. A lot of contracts will have an exclusivity provision, and they'll say something like Kaiser, for example. Kaiser has heavy-duty exclusivity provisions. It says basically, during the term of this contract, you may not provide professional medical services for any other entity, and any medical-related services that you provide, all proceeds from that, all earnings, you need to turn over to us. So for example, if you're a Kaiser doctor, I know it's heavy duty. If you're a Kaiser doctor, and maybe you have some friends who negotiated that away. If so, I want to talk to them because I've never succeeded in that, nor has anyone I know. But if you, for example, provide expert witness services, and you're a Kaiser doctor, that money's going to Kaiser, and that could be a lot of money. Or if you moonlight as the medical director of a treatment program, that money's going to Kaiser. A lot of other Kaisers on the heavier-handed side of that, other practices don't really care. Most practices, though, don't want you competing with them, don't want you taking work in their area during the term of the agreement. And oftentimes they'll want you to get written permission from the practice to engage in moonlighting. I can understand where they're coming from. I don't think it's unfair for them to want notice if you're going to be moonlighting or working elsewhere. But if you do plan to moonlight, if it's important to you, make sure that it's possible within the strictures of your agreement. And also, I wouldn't lead with that, like I'm planning on working somewhere else, but I would ask and find out how frequently they approve that kind of thing, or if they're actually really rigid about allowing physicians to work for other practices or in other roles. Another thing is that frequently those provisions will say just professional services, and they don't specify professional medical services. It's a small tweak, but I would go ahead and insert professional medical services so that if you want to write an incredible mystery novel in your free time, you can, and you don't have to turn the money over to them, because if it's super broadly written, they could argue. It doesn't apply to emergency treatment, so you can raise your hand on the plane still when somebody has a heart attack. And you might want to, if you already have an existing business, I had a client recently who had a consulting business that he had started pretty much unrelated to medicine, and he wanted to make sure that he could continue that, and he opted to try and carve that out explicitly in the contract. So if you've got something important going on already, you might want to go ahead and get it in the contract.
Is the exclusivity of practice, is that a non-compete, or is that non-compete for invalid in California?
I'm glad you asked that. So it's a form of a non-compete. She asked, is the exclusivity provision a non-compete? It's a form of non-compete. Non-competes are valid during the term of the agreement. After the term of the agreement, they are not valid. So your employer can say, while you are working for me, you may not work for anybody else. Your employer can say, after you finish working for me, you can't work for anybody else. That's invalid.
So what if you write that non and then you publish it out?
There's another law, it's like Flavor Code 2870 that would prevent them from doing that as long as you weren't using like the practice computer in your office there. And so write that in office. Sign up. Okay. And also, just to backtrack one sec on the exclusivity thing. Also, if you're logged in, if you want to do medical mission work, volunteer work and stuff, that will, your exclusivity provision may affect that as well. So be aware that it can be pretty broad. Okay, so we can move on. Sure.